All right, one more concept for the week. So we're evaluating deductive arguments, and the first step in doing that is to determine whether or not that argument is valid. And we do that in a really particular way. We assume the premises of the argument are true. And then we ask ourselves, if these premises are true, would the conclusion also have to be true? And if the answer to that is yes, that the conclusion would absolutely have to be true, there's no way that conclusion could be false when we assume those premises are true, then we've got a valid argument. We've got a nice, reliable argument. But if we can think of one way that conclusion could be false, even when the premises are true, then we've got an invalid argument, and it's unreliable. Now, the reason this is important is this. If we determine the argument is invalid, that means it's not reliable, and it's therefore not worth any more of our time. We shouldn't spend any more time evaluating an invalid argument than we would spend looking at a broken clock, wondering if it's telling us the right time of day. What a waste of time that would be. But if it's a valid argument, then we know this. Boy, if those premises turn out to be true, then I'll know one more thing about the world. I'll know whatever the conclusion said is also true. So a valid argument is worth our time. So we want to know in a valid argument, are those premises actually true? And we might then do the legwork to figure that out. Okay. The concept I'm leading to is this one, soundness. Soundness, again, is a property of deductive arguments only, not inductive arguments, and we're only looking at deductive arguments in our course. Okay, so soundness is a quality that exists in some valid arguments. It does not exist in invalid arguments. So the first thing we do is we ask ourselves, is this a valid argument or not? And if it isn't, we don't pay attention to it, but if it is, then we want to figure out if the premises are true. Because a valid argument with all true premises is a sound argument. But a valid argument with at least one untrue premise, one false premise, is an unsound argument. Okay, so valid argument with at least one false premise is an unsound argument. Invalid arguments we don't waste our time with, but a valid argument with all true premises is a sound argument. All right, so let's put this into play. So here's an argument for you to evaluate. If we're watching John talk about logic, then we're watching a video posted to YouTube. We are watching John talk about logic, therefore we're watching a video posted to YouTube. So the first step for you is going to be to pause this video and determine whether or not this is a valid argument. So look at those premises, assume they're true. Just work from the assumption those premises are true. We don't know that they are yet, but let's work from the assumption that they are, and then ask yourself, if they are true, is there any way that conclusion could be false? And when you think you've got your answer, go ahead and restart the video. All right. What'd you say? Valid or invalid? Valid? Right on. Yeah. If the premises are true, the conclusion would have to be true. So think about it. The first statement says this. If we're watching John talk about logic, then we're watching a video posted to YouTube. And the second premise says we are watching John talk about logic. All right. Well, if it's true, we're assuming, if it's true that we're watching John talk about logic, as the second premise says, and the first premise says, if we're doing that, then we'd be watching a video posted to YouTube, the conclusion has to be true. It has to be true. So this is a valid argument. So we can spend more time on this, and what we want to know is, all right, it's valid. Is it sound? In other words, does it have all true premises? All right, let's look at the first premise. I think that premise is true because at this point in our course, I haven't given you any other opportunities to watch me talk about logic. The only way you've been able to watch me talk about logic is via videos posted to YouTube. Even if you're watching it in the Canvas site, you're watching an embedded video. It's embedded in Canvas, but it's actually posted to YouTube. So you're sort of watching a YouTube video through Canvas. So that first premise is true because I haven't given you any other way to watch me talk about logic other than via videos posted to YouTube. And of course you're watching me talk about logic right now. Okay, so those two premises are true. We have two premises that are true and we have a valid argument. Therefore, we'd call this a sound argument. That's the best kind of deductive argument that we can have because we know these two things are true and that allows us to know like, oh, I guess this is true as well. All right. Now here's another argument. If a fish can swim, a fish can ride a bike, a fish can swim, therefore a fish can ride a bike. Why don't you go ahead and pause the video and determine whether or not this argument is valid or invalid. If it's invalid, we don't spend any more time with it, but if it's valid, then we do. All right. What did you think? I wonder if you saw something about this argument that's interesting. It's exactly the same type of argument as the first one. Do you see that? So in this first one, on the first premise, it says, if some set of conditions exist, we're watching John talk about logic, then another set of conditions will exist. We're watching a video posted to YouTube. And then the second premise says, you know what? That first set of conditions, it in fact does exist. And if you look at this argument, it's kind of doing the same thing. It's saying, if this set of conditions exist, a fish can swim, then a fish can ride a bike. And then the second premise says, you know what? That first set of conditions exists. Therefore, the conclusion says the second set of conditions exist. So this is an interesting example of what I was talking to you about in an earlier video, which is that validity refers to the form, not the content of a deductive argument. So when you look at these two arguments, they're actually the exact same form of argument. In fact, it has a name we'll talk about in a couple months called modus ponens, which is well, I shouldn't have said that. We'll talk about that later. But the point is that emphasizes to us that when we're looking at validity, we're really concerned about the form and not the content of the argument. Both of these arguments are perfectly valid. Okay? So this is a valid argument here. So that means it's worth more of our time. And so what we're going to do is ask ourselves, are the premises true? Because if they are, then the conclusion will have to be true. I look at that second premise, that's a true premise. But I look at the first premise and I say, no. It's not true that if a fish can swim, a fish can ride a bike. So that first premise is false. And what that tells me is I have a valid but unsound argument, and I get to walk away from it, because what that means is I don't know whether the conclusion has to be true or not. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. All I know is that this is a valid argument and that the conclusion doesn't necessarily follow from these premises because at least one of the premises is false. So valid but unsound. All right, try one more. If it's snowing, then the mail will be late. The mail's late, therefore it's snowing. Is that a valid argument? Why don't you go ahead and pause the video and think about that? Okay, so you're going to ask yourself, I'm going to assume the premises are true. If they're true, would the conclusion necessarily follow? So I really do want you to pause the video on this one and figure out if this is a valid argument or not. And then when you've got your answer, go ahead and hit the video, pause the video. All right. What do you think? Valid or invalid? Did I hear you say invalid? Yes, it's totally invalid. All right, let's just assume that if it's snowing, the mail will be late is true. I think that is a true statement, actually, because here in Humboldt, when it snows, the few times every decade that it does, people freak out. They don't know how to drive. We don't have mail trucks that are equipped to deal with snow readily. So everything kind of slows down. So I think that it's true that if it's snowing, the mail will be late. Let's just assume that the mail's late. My mail is in fact late today. It usually has already arrived by this time, and today it hasn't. So both those premises are true. How could it be false that it's snowing? Well, maybe the mail's late because the mail carrier got a flat tire. Maybe that's why my mail's late today. Or maybe the mail carrier got bit by a dog or something like that. So it is true today for me, right now at this moment, if it's snowing, the mail will be late. Again, I think that is a true statement here in Humboldt. And it is true for me today that the mail's late, but it's not true that it's snowing. In fact, it's really warm outside right now, okay? So this is an invalid argument. And again, this has a fancy name too, called affirming the consequent, but we'll talk about that later. So because it's an invalid argument, we're like, peace out. I'm no longer concerned with this argument. Okay. All right. We'll do just two more and then we'll wrap this up. All right. So one argument says if the stuff in John's water bottle, or I guess says if the stuff in John's bottle is water, then it's wet. The stuff in John's bottle is not wet. Therefore, the stuff in John's bottle is not water. Think about that. Is that a valid argument? If it's true that if the stuff in John's bottle is water, then it's wet, and if it's true that the stuff in John's bottle is not wet, does that mean it has to be true that the stuff in John's bottle is not water? So think about that. If you want more time to think about it, you could do my favorite thing, which is pause the video and think about it. All right? All right. Let's just assume it's true that if the stuff in John's bottle is water, then it's wet. I think we'll just assume that's true. And let's just assume it's true that the stuff in John's bottle is not wet. Would it have to be true that the stuff in John's bottle is not water? Yes. This is a valid argument. It actually has another fancy name called modus tollens. All right? That's what the form of the argument is. So think about this. If it's true that if the stuff in John's water bottle, if it's true that if the stuff in John's bottle is water, then it's wet. And if it's true that the stuff in John's bottle is not wet, it would have to be true that the stuff in John's bottle is not wet, because as the first premise says, if it is water, then it would be wet. And the second premise says, but it's not wet. Therefore, it has to be the case that it's not water, because, as the first premise says, if it was water, it'd be wet. So this is a valid argument. So if it's a valid argument, it deserves more of our time. So let's determine whether or not this argument is true, or these premises are true, and I have props. I think it is true that if the stuff in John's bottle is water, then it's wet. I think that premise is true. Here's the stuff in John's bottle. I have a couple of ink pens in there, but no water. Okay, those ink pens are not wet, so that second premise is true. Therefore, the conclusion is also true. All right. That's a valid argument with true premises, which means it's a sound argument. All right, so let's look at this one. If the stuff in John's bottle is water, then it's wet. The stuff in John's bottle is wet. Therefore, the stuff in John's bottle is water. Valid like salad or invalid? If you want to, you could do my favorite thing and pause the video and determine that for yourself. All right. This argument is invalid. Okay? If the stuff in John's bottle is water, then it's wet. The absolutely true premise, just like it was true in this first argument. The stuff in John's bottle is wet. Can you see that? Can you hear that? But that doesn't necessarily mean the stuff in John's bottle is water. Maybe I've got vodka in here and it just looks like water. All right? By the way, a public service announcement, don't drink and do logic. It makes it way harder. So that is, in fact, water. So that's actually an interesting case. So this argument is invalid, which means we don't have to give it any more time, okay? But look at what's going on. The first premise is true. The second premise is also true. And the conclusion also happens to be true in this case. But it's an unreliable argument because we can think of at least one way that conclusion could have been false. So just like the broken clock is right twice a day, sometimes invalid arguments have true conclusions and all true premises. But it doesn't matter. We can't rely on those invalid arguments any more than we can rely on broken clocks to tell us the right time. It would just be a coincidence, like it is here, that the clock is giving us the right time. All right, next steps. Read chapters 1.3 and 1.4 in Hurley. In chapter 1.3, you should really not delve too deeply into that chapter. Focus on only the information that has to do with deductive arguments, okay? Don't look at all at things like cogency or strength and weakness. You're not concerned with any of that. The only things you're concerned about in 1.3 and 1.4 are things having to do with deductive arguments, validity, and soundness. That's it, okay? So focus all your energy on those things. You'll do your thought primer exercises, you'll watch the videos, and you can check and correct your work. If you watch the answers to those exercise problems and don't understand why one of the answers is what it is, please email me, because then I can whip up a video explanation really quickly and post it so other people can see it too. Or you and I can Zoom together and we can go over it until you really understand it. It's super important that you get your head wrapped around these really basic concepts, because we're going to start applying them to complicated arguments here in the weeks to come. All right? So there'll be a couple of problems on your thought primer that you won't self-correct. You'll send them to me. So you want to do that. And then again, I have this, why do I have it? Email me your thought primer. Don't email me your thought primer, okay? Send your thought primer to me through Canvas on the assignment link. All right, and then I'll send it back to you through that same thing. Then once you've done that, it's time to party, because you've finished up the entire week of logic.